The 1968 Democratic National Convention is typically seen as the biggest debacle or one of the biggest debacles in political history in the United States, which is saying something. For those who don't remember, a national convention, whether it's Democratic or Republican, is how the two parties select the role of president. Most modern conventions are what are called uncontested, which means both parties know going in who the nominee is going to be. That was not the case in the 1968 Democratic Convention, which was held in Chicago, Illinois. Uh, the 1968 Democratic National Convention was torn by two huge issues. One was the ongoing war in Vietnam, and the other was the turbulence that continued to grip the South even after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Um, just a couple of months before the Democratic National Convention, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated, which left the country reeling. And even though segregation had officially ended, racism and poverty continued to make life very difficult for many Black Americans across the United States. So this was really kind of a showdown in 1968 between the establishment, the presidency of Lyndon Blaine Johnson, LBJ, and America's Democratic base, which was increasingly growing weary over the two issues, the civil rights movement in the South and the Vietnam War. By the time delegates arrived for the convention in Chicago, protests had already been set in motion by members of what was called the Youth International Party, or as they were typically called, Yippies, not hippies, Yippies with a Y, and the National Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam, MOB. And there's a couple of important people that deal with that, but I'm not going to touch on them in this particular discussion because this is just meant to be a very quick overview of the convention. Chicago's then current mayor, however, Richard Daley, had absolutely no intention of letting his city be overrun by protesters, and so the stage was set for a dramatic and explosive confrontation between the establishment, supported by the police, and predominantly the youth of the Democratic Party, which had become increasingly disenchanted with the directions that the party had taken. The the party itself was in absolute crisis in 1968. President Johnson had won re-election in 1964 with a huge majority, but his decision to support both the war in Vietnam and the civil rights movement in the South had left him without a base of support going into the convention in 1968. And so in November of 1967, a relatively unknown Minnesota senator named Eugene McCarthy, whose name really isn't that important, he's not related to Joseph McCarthy, by the way, announced his intent to challenge Johnson for the Democratic presidential nomination. This typically doesn't happen. Normally, when you have a sitting president who can run for reelection, they do not get challenges from within their own party. And then, even more shockingly, in March of 1968, McCarthy actually won 40% of the vote in the New Hampshire presidential primary, which validated his candidacy and threw a huge monkey wrench into President Johnson's reelection machine. A few days after that, a very influential senator and brother to deceased John F. Kennedy, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, abandoned his support for Johnson and declared his own interest in running for president. Unfortunately, he is also going to be assassinated. President Johnson saw the writing on the wall and on March the 31st told the nation during a televised address, and this was absolutely shocking, that he was not going to seek reelection. The following month, then Vice President Hubert Humphrey, backed by Johnson, announced his candidacy for the nomination, further dividing an already divided Democratic Party. About a week before the convention in Chicago, despite not having official permission to be there, thousands of protesters erected a sort of makeshift camp in what was Lincoln Park in Chicago, about 10 miles from the amphitheater, which is where the convention was going to be held. Expecting resistance, protest leaders actually organized self defense training sessions, including things like karate. But in the meantime, Democratic Party delegates had started to arrive in Chicago, and the situation around the amphitheater would have looked something like a medieval siege. You have to imagine a Democratic convention that's being held in this large amphitheater, but that is ringed with barricades and with police officers who have no intention of allowing the protesters anywhere close to either the convention itself or the hotels where the delegates were staying. So initially, Mayor Daley let the protesters stay in Lincoln Park. But the day before the convention is set to begin, he orders Chicago police to clear the park, stating the city's 11 p.m. park curfew as the reason. He was hoping that this was going to be a show of force that would get the protesters to leave before the convention actually started. Now, the mood at Lincoln Park was actually festive at first. There were impromptu yoga sessions, a lot of music, dancing, sort of general revelry. But as that curfew sets in and as the effort to clear out the park begins, the mood abruptly shifts. So around 11 p.m. on that Sunday, August the 25th, 1968, several thousand police officers wearing riot gear, helmets, and gas masks line up at the edge of Lincoln Park, and some initially threw tear gas into the crowd. Protesters start to scatter every direction, falling over each other, running into each other, and some of the protest then turns violent. The police begin attacking people with clubs. Suddenly, the individuals in the crowd start fighting back. There is a huge dispute, even today, that we don't have time to get into over who started the brawl. But every eyewitness report indicates that this was an absolutely chaotic scene of unrestrained bloodshed. Later, the police simply defended their actions by claiming the protesters should not have broken curfew or resisted arrest. Many protesters suggested that they were attempting to leave the park when they were attacked in an unprovoked manner. The two sides continue to go back and forth to this day. Now, as things are heating up in the two parks, Lincoln Park, and there's a simultaneous demonstration going on in Grant Park in Chicago, things are also heating up on the convention floor. There's a portion of the Democratic Party called the Peace Plank. The Peace Plank wants an immediate end to the war in Vietnam. Their defeat in the convention itself was a huge blow to the peace process and to the millions of Americans who wanted the Vietnam War to end. And the delegates that evening erupt into their own sort of chaos. So you have chaos going on within the convention, chaos going on outside the convention. In the words of one delegate, they said, quote, "We were all desolate. All the work we had done, all the effort we had made, it seemed like it had come to naught and our hearts were broken," end quote. While this is going on, because there's not enough chaos yet, by nightfall, there's another confrontation outside the Hilton Hotel between thousands of angry protesters and thousands of equally angry police officers. Once again, I have to remind you, no one knows who or what triggered the first blow. But suddenly, the police began clearing out the crowd, pummeling protesters. Some of them were just innocent bystanders who actually weren't there to protest at all, and using so much tear gas that it reportedly leaked into Hubert Humphrey's room 25 floors up as he watched the chaos unfold from his hotel room window. At home in their living rooms, horrified Americans watched as the news switched between images of police brutality beating young blood splattered demonstrators and Hubert Humphrey accepting the party's nomination. Quite the juxtaposition. During the nomination, some of the delegates actually tried to speak out against the violence unfolding outside the convention. One pro McGovern delegate actually went so far as to refer to the police violence as a Gestapo tactic. But late in that evening, Hubert Humphrey won the presidential nomination and selected Senator Edward Muskie as Maine and his running mate. But the win was absolutely nothing to celebrate. The convention had absolutely shattered what remained of Democratic unity in 1968, and there wasn't much Democratic unity to begin with. The next day, hundreds of anti war delegates attempted to go back to the amphitheater but were deterred with tear gas. At midnight on August the 29th, 1968, the bloody and contentious Democratic convention officially came to an end. The chaos of the Democratic Party would lead to an easy victory by Republican nominee Richard Nixon later that same year.